In the farthest reaches of the Appalachian backwoods, where maps lose their meaning and roads surrender to wilderness, there stood a cabin. It was a structure older than memory itself, its wood blackened by rain, its roof sagging under the weight of countless winters. Few had ever laid eyes upon it, and those who did never lingered long. The forest around it seemed to breathe differently, as though the trees themselves were guardians of some unspoken secret. No birds sang in its branches, no animals dared nest nearby. Even the wind, restless in the mountains, passed over that hollow and uneasy silence. For generations, the cabin had remained hidden from the world, its presence carried only in whispers told at night, when the fire burned low and elders warned the young of places better left alone. They said the ground beneath it drank sorrow like water, and the walls had absorbed screams that no human ear was meant to hear. Travelers who lost their way sometimes spoke of it, an old log house standing crooked in the clearing, its windows black as eyes that watched. Yet, by the time they returned to tell the tale, the path back was gone. It was as if the cabin itself shifted with the woods, appearing only when it wanted to be seen. The locals gave it a name they spoke reluctantly, the house where blood never left. No one asked what that meant, for in those mountains, some knowledge was more dangerous than ignorance. The story begins with a man who lived in that cabin, a farmer hardened by isolation and hunger. He was a widower, left with nothing but his land, his tools, and his only daughter. In those mountains, distance from neighbors was measured not in miles but in days, and in that silence, he became both master and jailer of his household. What started as loneliness soon twisted into something far darker. The man believed blood should never mix with outsiders, that his family must remain pure, untouched by the corruption of the world beyond the ridges. This belief, born of pride and madness, grew into law within the walls of the cabin. The daughter, young and defenseless, was bound not by rope but by fear. She was told her voice was useless, that the forest would swallow her whole if she tried to flee, and that no one beyond those woods would believe her cries. The father's will became her prison, and silence her only escape. It was in that silence that she bore her first child. And then another. Children who carried not only her blood but the blood of her father. They grew up knowing the same narrow world, the cabin, the fields, the woods that closed in like bars of a cage. The man aged, but his sin endured, stitched into the very lineage of his family. What he had done could not be undone, for the bloodline itself was now a record of his crime. And though the daughter lived on, her eyes told the truth of it. She was both victim and keeper of a secret too dark for the world to hear. Among the children born of that silence was a boy who carried the heaviest burden of all. He grew up in the half-light of the cabin, never knowing the laughter of other children or the comfort of a world beyond the trees. His earliest memories were of shadows stretching across the walls, of whispers that never explained who he truly was. He knew his mother, though even that word felt uncertain. She was too young to carry the weight of motherhood, yet too broken to be anything else. And the man he called father was also something more, something unspoken, something that hung over him like a storm that never passed. As he grew, questions sharpened within him. Why did his mother's eyes never meet his own? Why did the man's warnings echo with such finality, as though the world outside was filled with monsters far worse than the one inside? The boy learned early that silence was survival, that curiosity itself could bring punishment. In the stillness of the woods, he began to understand the truth. His mother was not just mother, she was sister, too. The lines that separated one role from another had been erased, leaving him trapped in a bloodline twisted upon itself. The boy carried that knowledge like a weight in his chest. He was both son and brother, bound to a family that would never allow him the freedom to be simply one thing. And though he lived, though he breathed, there was a darkness in his eyes that told the story. He had been born into a world where innocence had no place, and where blood was destiny. When age began to weigh upon the old man, his grip over the cabin weakened, but his shadow never lifted. The sickness of his mind had already been planted deep, and its roots spread into the lives of those who remained. His son, now grown into a young man, was chosen to inherit not just the land or the house, but the very sin that had cursed them all. It was spoken to him as a duty, a sacred task to keep the blood pure. The words were heavy, carrying the weight of both perdition and command. And so the son was bound to a fate more horrifying than death. He was made to stand where his father once stood, husband to the woman who had given him life. The mother, broken long before her time, yielded in silence. Her voice had been stolen years earlier, and what remained of her spirit was only a shadow. She became both mother and wife, trapped in a role no human heart could bear. Her eyes no longer lifted to the sky, for she knew there was no heaven for her beyond those walls. From that union, children were born again, children who carried within them the echo of generations twisted by the same hand. Their cries filled the hollow, sharp and piercing, as if the very air resisted the continuation of such a bloodline. The twisted marriage was not spoken of beyond the cabin, yet its weight lingered in the valley like smoke that would not rise. It was more than sin, more than madness. It was a binding of flesh and blood that chained one generation to the next, ensuring that no one would ever walk free of that curse. From the twisted marriage came children, fragile and strange, their faces carrying the burden of a lineage folded in upon itself. Some were born weak, their bodies unable to hold life for long. Others lived, but bore marks that spoke of bloodlines too closely bound, crooked limbs, clouded eyes, and minds that wandered in silence. The cabin became a cradle of sorrow, echoing with cries that faded too quickly into stillness. Each new birth carried less promise, as though the blood itself grew tired of sustaining what should not be. Yet the cycle continued, for there was no escape, only repetition of the same dark command that had bound their family from the start. Neighbors, distant though they were, began to whisper of what they sensed in the hollow. Strange cries drifting through the trees at night, shapes glimpsed in the undergrowth that did not seem wholly human, and pale figures that watched from the shadows before vanishing into the brush. The land itself seemed to shudder, as if weary of the footsteps it carried. Children of shadows, born from silence and sin, carried the weight of their fathers and mothers before them. They grew not as branches reaching outward, but as a vine curling endlessly back upon itself. Each face, each pair of eyes, reflected the truth no one dared speak. This was a family not of growth, but of decay, and so the hollow was marked not by the graves that sank into its soil, but by the living remnants who bore the curse in their very flesh. Generations twisted together, bound by chains invisible yet unbreakable, until the line itself seemed less like blood and more like a shadow stretching into eternity. Though the family rarely stepped beyond the clearing, their shadow crept far wider than the cabin walls. Travelers spoke of the place in hushed tones, telling of nights when the forest seemed alive with whispers, or of eyes that glowed faintly in the treeline before vanishing into the dark. Those who wandered too close felt the weight of being watched, as if the very woods carried the family's gaze. Once, a preacher came from the valley below, drawn by stories of a household untouched by church or scripture. He climbed the ridge, Bible in hand, promising to bring salvation to the forgotten. But he was never seen again. Only his horse returned, foaming and wild-eyed, as if it had escaped something no man should face. The people below knew then that the curse was not only contained, it reached outward, claiming whoever dared disturb its silence. Rumors grew, and with them, fear. Locals avoided the hollow, refusing to hunt its deer or cut its timber. They said the land itself was poisoned by what had happened there, that the soil drank more than rain, and that the roots of the trees carried secrets up from the ground. The valley came to be called by a name spoken only in whispers, the Valley of Shadows. No one claimed it, no one entered it, and no one forgot it. For though the cabin stood hidden, its curse moved like smoke unseen, but impossible to ignore. Years passed, and the cabin that once pulsed with cries and whispers fell silent. No smoke rose from its chimney, no light burned in its windows. The clearing grew wild again, grass swallowing the path, vines tightening around the rotting timbers as though the forest itself sought to erase what had stood there. When at last a hunting party stumbled upon it, they found only remnants of a life long abandoned. The roof sagged inward, the hearth was cold, and the rooms smelled of damp earth. Broken chairs leaned in corners, a cradle rocked empty, and scraps of journals lay scattered, pages filled with names, marks, and ramblings no sane hand would write. But there were no bodies. The family was gone. Some believed they had perished, swallowed by the same land that had hidden them for generations. Others whispered that they had moved deeper into the mountains, carrying their bloodline with them, unseen but never broken. Even now, locals tell of strange figures in the distance, faces pale as ash, eyes that glimmer with something not quite human, children whose laughter echoes in the woods where no children live. The curse, they say, did not die with the cabin. It walks, carried by those who were born of it, lingering in the valleys and hollows where the sun rarely shines, and so the story remains unfinished, a legacy preserved not in stone or grave, but in silence. A silence heavier than words, whispering still through the trees, that blood, once tainted, leaves a shadow that never fades.